Before I turn the podium over to the author of this wonderful book, I had the privilege of reading an early version of it, Little Soldiers. And so you're going to get a wonderful introduction to what's going on today in Chinese education. And this is a book that you'll definitely want to pre-order. But before I formally turn this over to Lenora Chu, I'd like to highlight a resource that you may not be aware of. It comes out 3 times a year. It's called Education About Asia. Education About Asia. And it's aimed at teachers. It's a publication from the Association for Asian Studies, and it's terrific. It's not just focused on China, obviously, but there's tremendous China content in it. Full disclosure, I'm on the editorial board, so, but I get paid big bucks for that position, so you'll want to take that into consideration. And so even if you don't pony up the 25 bucks or whatever for a year subscription for this, you have access to all the back issues. And it's more than 20 years old, so 20 years of articles about important subjects, including something that's going to come up a little bit now that we haven't talked about in depth. Yong Cai talked about this a little bit when he talked about hukou, and Eric made reference to it in his response to one of the questions. The 2 giant institutions that have really shaped contemporary China, part of it is the family planning policy, but also the hukou system. And that hukou system had tremendous relevance for 2 institutions even today. Hukou is not as important as it used to be, household registration. But in education and in healthcare, it's still all important. And so it's something that you can learn about through some of the back articles as well as what you're about to hear. We are really privileged. You folks are extremely lucky, as am I, to have this opportunity to hear from Lenora Chu. She's worked in all of the journalistic media that you can imagine. She's been a radio reporter, a TV reporter, a print reporter, and this book comes out of her deep work as a reporter in China. This is a reported book. She's gone around and interviewed scholars. She's been in classrooms. She's done all of that. But it also is informed by the fact that she's a mother of a child, a little soldier. Ladies, gentlemen, please welcome Lenora Chu.
Thanks, Clay, for that wonderful introduction and also for your early support for this book. Lenora Chu here. Thanks for this invitation, Sandra, Paul, Monica. I'm thrilled to be here today. As Clay said, I'm an American journalist living in Shanghai, and I've got this book coming out in 2 months. Hope you get that cover imprinted in your brain so you can tell everyone about it. 3 objectives for today's talk. I'm going to give you an overview of China's school system. It is the world's largest system. Identify areas that the government is trying to change. The reform efforts, I think, are very interesting, and it's not something that Western media usually covers and that people really talk about. And lastly, consider what features of Chinese education are worth learning from. There are a few, no matter what people say. It's a very polarizing issue, the way the Chinese educate. When Western media covers Chinese education, they do so in extremes. First, a little bit about me. So my parents emigrated from China to the US, and I was born and raised here in America in Texas, and then I spent most of my adult life in California, went to Stanford, just down the way. And in 2010, my husband and I moved to Shanghai. We're both journalists. Now, 2010 in Shanghai was a monumental year for Chinese education because that year a test called PISA came out, and Shanghai teens took #1 in the world across the board in math, reading, and science. Now, this was a shock to everybody. The U.S., as usual, fell somewhere kind of in the middle of the heap if you watch these rankings. Commence media frenzy, right? News headlines around the time, you saw prominent Americans saying that the Chinese had education figured out. There was also a distinct voice of criticism that said the Chinese were hamstrung to a test-based education system. Now, which is it, right? Is it rote learning robots, or is it the world's top academic achievers? Depends on whom you ask. in China, I was watching all these news headlines and I started talking to Chinese educators. And what was interesting to me was that they were not celebrating. So this guy here, Zhang Mingxuan, he actually ran PISA. He spent 3 years working on this project, and he came out and said, PISA does not mean we have a good fundamental education. I said, that's really interesting. The guy who runs PISA doesn't think PISA means that much. Underneath him, Yang Dongping, he's a very famous Chinese education reformer. And he said, PISA's great, but he's looking across the straits to, South Korea, Taiwan, Japan. They did just as well as Shanghai, almost, but they spent half the time in study. Meanwhile, the Americans on the right side, Arne Duncan, Secretary of Education, China is a wake-up call. The Shanghai Secret, Thomas Friedman. And of course, President Obama, 50 years later, our generation's Sputnik moment is back. What's the real story? So this is my son. He's the only one who's out of line. He's second from the back there. And this is pretty much, this picture encapsulates our time in China, because here I am, this Chinese American. I speak Mandarin, but I was also raised in an American school system. So I land smack dab in the middle of Shanghai, and things immediately start happening. The first week of school, let me back up a little bit. He's in this very elite sort of Shanghai kindergarten. It's a public school. It's just a few blocks down the street from our home. I think it's a great idea. Why not instill some of those Chinese academic values? Well, the first week, his teacher forces him to eat eggs. He hates eggs, and he marches home and he sort of tells me about it, and I said, that's interesting. I'm a little bit upset about this. So I march off to school and I confront the teacher, and she says, well, how do you do it? How do you get kids to eat eggs? And I say, well, we incent them to choose. We explain the benefits of egg eating. We talk about nutrients, how they might be able to see planes better in the sky, and we don't use force. And she says, does it work? Of course it doesn't, right? So clearly, here I am with my democratic, choice values, and I march off to Shanghai, and it's not really working so well. She basically gives me a lecture and says, don't ever question my methods in front of a child. So that's teacher knows best. It's an authoritarian classroom, and that set up sort of the stage for many clashes to come. So this was my laboratory by which to explore Chinese education. What price do the Chinese pay for their academic success, if they do pay a price? What changes were they trying to make, and what can the rest of the world learn from the Chinese way? I also follow 2 Shanghai high school students, and I also follow a rural family. I bring in other characters so that I'm not just looking at early education, but also high school education and eventually the college entrance examination process. That's little Jun Xun here on the right. He's in his yellow t-shirt. I've been stalking this family for 5 years. His mother and I are now very good friends. And this is just about 2 minutes before he's to walk into the National High School entrance exam. This is a very big day for this family, and his story is also in the book. Overview of the education system. Now, how big is China's school system? 200 million students in primary through uni. It's about 250 million if you include kindergartners, compared with 75 million in the US. The budget is about a third of what the US spends on public primary and secondary. You'll see that per pupil expenditures are just a fraction of what they spend in the US. I thought that was very interesting. Almost 3 times as many primary and secondary schools, university degrees. Dr. Yongcai had mentioned this earlier, 7 to 8 million a year that they're minting out of their colleges and universities. To me, it's still interesting though. America has almost double the number of higher education institutions. China, I think they've done a lot in compulsory education. They're just now turning their attention to higher ed. They're spending a lot of money trying to develop that colleges, the university sector, and also vocational education in the higher ed sector. What's important to understand is that education in China is a sorting mechanism. It's from a very young age, educational is essentially a race to advance. There's 18 million babies born in China every year compared to about 4 million in the US. So now you can imagine you're a parent of one of those 18 million kids. You look up the ladder and you see only, 300,000 coming out at the very top, right? From a very young age. Even in rural areas, they're thinking about Tsinghua University. There's a phrase, Qingbei Fujiao, which is Tsinghua, Beida, Fudan, and Jiaotong University. These are the top 4 universities in China, and even the rural school kids know about this. Of course, very few ever make it to the top. 16 million kids sit for the high school entrance exam, about half fail. Once you get to the college level, 10 million students sitting for that exam, about a third drop off. This does not include vocational education, it's just the normal academic track. This is what I call a high-stakes education system. It's a sorting mechanism, as I said, and all kinds of things are conferred by how you do on this ladder: social status, financial stability, bragging rights for your family. Education is very, very important. What's more, these tests are posted publicly. Students are ranked based on their scores. Teachers are given performance pay based on how their students score. Schools are also ranked based on how their kids perform on these tests. Everything is tied to this ladder. One of my characters in the book, Teacher Wang, actually you ask any Chinese in the primary and secondary school system, how do you rank? And Teacher Wang told me about her daughter. My daughter is 6th in math, 5th in English, 9th in Chinese, and 4th in physics out of 47 classmates. Overall, she's 89 out of 395 kids in her grade. These numbers sort of roll off your tongue if you're a Chinese student. You pay a lot of attention to these numbers. Tests. This is a bunch of students sitting for the Gaokao, or the National College Entrance Exam. The country stops for 2 days, public transportation. They make sure everything's very quiet. The streets are closed down around the test sites. No distractions. Very, very important. So what happens when your education system looks like that? There are some negative effects. And these phrases were all taken from Chinese government documents, Chinese news media reports. These are not Western critics. These are the Chinese themselves. No time for sports and exercise, crushing academic pressure. Students are test-taking automatons. Socio-emotional competencies. Every year or so, there's a horrid news story about a Chinese student poisoning a classmate, or something happens. Or a few years ago, a Tsinghua student threw a bunch of sulfuric acid on bears at the Beijing Zoo. So, all these Chinese commentators come out of the woodwork and say, see, we're not teaching our kids how to be social, how to value others. There's a lot of problems that come out of the system, and they're trying to fix it. Another problem, inequality. The system is really not a meritocracy. It's important for the government to sell it as a meritocracy because then everyone buys in. But it's actually not, because money buys a lot of things. It buys test preparation. It buys tutors. If you fail the high school entrance exam, you can actually find the right person and buy backdoor admissions. There's a lot of gray money running around in the system. Xi Jinping has tried to crack down on a lot of that, but I think, in my assessment, it's only served to push a lot of that underground. So this inequality, this money, this gray money in the system, that's another thing that they are working hard to fix. Location also helps. Eric Fish had talked about the hukou. It's basically an internal passport system which ties a student to his place of birth. So if you look at his hukou, this passport, and it says Henan County, you can go anywhere up until the time you're 15 or 16, but then you have to go back to Henan County to sit for high school and take that national college entrance exam. The problem with that, it's like if I was born in Philadelphia, but I left when I was 2. So it's as if by the time I got to high school, I'd have to go back, even though I didn't know anybody there anymore. And, I left when I was in diapers, and I had to take the SAT there, and the chances of me getting into, say Harvard or whatever it is more difficult in Philadelphia than it is if you were in Boston or New York City. That's basically what these Chinese kids are facing. And researchers have called this hukou system basically Chinese apartheid, because if you're a rural hukou holder, it's much harder to get into, say, Tsinghua than if you're from Shanghai or Beijing and hold that kind of hukou. So this is another thing that the Chinese government seems to want to fix, but they're sort of at a loss on how to do it. So the system's full of contradictions. Shanghai PISA is #1 in the world. Countryside schools fall far behind. I think it was Eric who had mentioned the left behinds. I spent a couple of weeks teaching in rural Henan County. These kids have no adult supervision. Their teacher was there for 3 months and she'll probably be gone in 3 months later. So Shanghai kids have a lot of resources. There's a lot of attention devoted there, but this is what it looks like in the countryside, in some parts of the countryside. Okay, so this is little Tong. Her story sort of breaks my heart. I met her 18 days before the high school entrance exam. She fails and she goes to work. So, she sends me pictures. This is 3 years later. That's her in the upper right. She's working as a masseuse in Xinjiang province. Her parents, she scored something like 300 and you need a 500 to get into high school. And it was just too far of a gap to make up with backdoor admissions, or you can actually pay for points in certain parts of the country. So now she's working with her hands. Other issues, barriers to creativity and independent expression. What is creativity? Coming up with something new and original, which also has value. I think that's how most people define it from an academic perspective. How do you do that? Some people see that as overcoming constraints, coming up with original ideas, doing something a different way. Well, every Chinese student, just ask, has a story about how they were discouraged from coming up with a new and original idea in the classroom. For me, it was the egg story. Parents are expected to fall in line too. You're not really supposed to challenge the teacher or the principal in any significant way. Other stories, one character in my book, she tried to do something a different way. She drew a foot on a turtle, or I can't remember exactly what the equation was, but the teacher sort of tacked her paper on the wall and shamed her before the whole class. Every school child has an experience like this, and you learn very quickly that you try to conform to the norm, you do what you're told, you study for that test, and that's how you get ahead. This is collectivist thought. So I told a room full of students, I gave them construction paper, glue, popsicle sticks, whatever they wanted, and I said, I want you to construct your dream. So these two kids did exactly the same thing, down to the cut and color of the sun. Now, I don't think this would happen in an American classroom, and there's nothing wrong with this. I just wanted to illustrate that this is an example of collectivism, of thinking more as a group than the individual. This is perfectly fine in the Chinese classroom. Political, I promise we'll get to some positive aspects very soon, but one more thing, political curriculum in the classroom. So my son, when he was 4 years old, he comes home, he's drawing over by the window, and this comes out. Can anyone tell what this is? Yeah. So there's Mao Zedong in the middle there, looks like an egghead. There's fireworks. So I asked him, what did the teacher tell you about Tiananmen Square? And of course, pro-democracy movement, no. Government-sanctioned massacre in the square, no. Tiananmen Square is a monument to Chinese excellence and to Mao Zedong, and that's fine. But they start this very, very early in schools. It started very early. Eric Fish had talked about military training. Well, this is what it looks like on 5-year-olds. My Chinese friend took this video just 2 months ago at a kindergarten in Shanghai. It's just preparation. It's getting used to, wearing this kind of uniform. That's the red tie that every school child wears. Other problems with the system. Maybe let's move on to the positives. I'm just kidding. Let's see. So one more word about political curriculum. Actually, I should go back to this slide. We talked a lot about whether this actually works. Clearly the Communist Party controls the education system. They see the education system as a means of governing, as a means of rule, and they don't hide this. This is just a practical way of delivering education. As the Chinese are going overseas, they're going abroad, they think that patriotism is one way to keep everyone loyal to the motherland. In my book, there's a scene, my 4-year-old just come home from school and he's singing the lyrics to The East is Red. He's also learned a song which, contributed to the title of my book. It's 我是小小兵. It's basically, I'm a little soldier. I set my sights on the distance. I work very hard as a group to achieve my goal. So this concerns me, and I turn to 2 Shanghai high school students that I've known for years, and they also appear in the book. And every once in a while, I check in with them. What do you think about your education system? How do you learn math? What do you think about the college entrance exam? And for this part, I ask them about political education. I ask them how successful it is. And here's what they tell me. Their names are Darcy and Amanda. Let's see if I can find it. I broached the topic with Darcy, who shrugged off my concerns. China would never be a united front of patriots, Darcy said, voice low, in an unguarded moment. Nationalism is all more in theory. In real life, he said, human nature makes people consider themselves. Amanda's conviction was even firmer. The curriculum is all bullshit. It's brainwashing. On the surface, teachers praise socialism. The party members need to write reports. But everyone knows this is not a socialist economy. It's obvious. It's obvious to everyone. School might have a student's attention for the moment, but try as it might, it is clear that the powers cannot control context, critical thought, or anything that proliferates inside the privacy of one's own head. China might conceive of a nation of patriots. Inside a child's educational journey, there might be times that towing the party line might seem expedient or even necessary. But the Chinese that I knew recognized the party's blatant attempts to censor and control access to information, and ultimately Amanda, Darcy, and all of China's moral education scholars were convinced that there was nothing to worry about from a parent's perspective. China's grip on the hearts and minds of its people would only grow more tenuous. And I think that's true. I think that as much as they try, and they are trying, just earlier in 2017, they changed the start of the Sino-Japanese conflict. They moved it up by 6 years. So now this, in all their textbooks, they changed all the textbooks so that the conflict starts with, let's see, what year was that, 1931? And the idea is that if you lengthen the conflict, you make Chinese more angry at the Japanese and instill more patriotism. So they do things like that. With a broad stroke, they censor and change all the textbooks. But I think, most Chinese now, they have access to information. And that is in direct conflict with what they're learning in the classrooms. And some people say this will lead to a spiritual crisis. And it is. Okay, so what is China trying to change? Quite a lot. They have policies stretching back 2 decades. In 2010, they came out with a national education reform plan, and there really is nothing that isn't touched by their plans. In Shanghai, which is a pilot district, the idea that you lessen the importance of entrance examinations, then you lessen the academic burden for students. They're studying less. They have more time for sports and that sort of thing. So in Shanghai at the bottom there, they're giving you 2 chances for the college entrance exam. With the SAT, you can take it as many times as you want. Well, they're trying to do the same thing for the college entrance exam. They've installed psychologists in most middle and high schools, although if you talk to those psychologists, they say nobody comes to see me because they're still studying for exams, but at least they're trying. They've shortened the school day. Some schools have, the idea being that they can play soccer or whatever it is. Earlier this year, my son's school said they were going to let out at 2 o'clock instead of 3, and they gave us a day's notice. But, so these things are happening. That was fun. That was a fun day. They limit homework in early primary. There's all kinds of things that they're trying. The National Plan for Medium and Long-Term Education Reform and Development, 27,000 characters. And this is a big deal. They spent years working on it. They put it on the web, and they asked for comments from Chinese citizens. They got millions of comments. It went through 40 revisions, and this is what they came out with. These are their 4 top priorities. They want to popularize education. They still don't have everyone enrolled in compulsory education, despite having worked on it for 30 years. Equal education for everyone. They're attacking inequality. Obviously, the quality of education is different if you're one of those kids in that rural classroom versus a kid in Shanghai. So they're trying to smooth that out. Quality education. These are sort of the socioeconomic and quality factors. They're not related to learning math and science, but it's more about, can you work with people? Are you kind to your peers? Psychological health, physical health. And lifelong education. And this is about expanding the vocational track so that all those kids that fall off that ladder have something else to do, someplace else to go. And nursing is a vocational track, for example. There are a lot of things that they're trying to do to keep kids in the pipeline so that they're not just at 17 failing that exam and sort of going out to work. Are there other options? And that's what that last one is about. These are just some more goals in detail. I think that maybe we'll pass these slides around later, and then you can look at it if it catches your interest. But generally, universal preschool for at least 1 year, increasing high school enrollment. Compulsory education actually finishes at grade 9, so they're trying to make high school compulsory as well, 10th, 11th, and 12th grade. Eliminate illiteracy. They've done a really good job. 60 years ago, 4 of every 5 Chinese couldn't read, and they've pretty much reversed that trend, but there's still a long ways to go. Enhance special education. They're taking a lot of notes from us, actually, here in America. They didn't believe in mainstreaming until just recently, so they're really trying to work on this, especially in major cities like Shanghai and Beijing. But still, for the most part, there are special institutions for kids with special needs. Development goals and numbers, they've met some of them. For example, the preschool, they have achieved at least 3 years of preschool for 70% of the preschool population. They're still working on high school enrollment. That's going to be a very difficult one, because by the time the kids get to be 15 and 16 in rural areas, their parents look at them and say, you could be working and earning money instead of sitting in a school and not earning money. Other system reforms, they have the same problems that we do. They're not, there's a shortage of people now wanting to go into teaching professions. They've spent a lot of time and effort on trying to increase teacher salaries and increase the incentives to get people into the pipeline. Measures to guarantee reform, more of the same. Unfortunately, surveys have shown little reform progress, and part of the reason is that you can't change behavior if you haven't changed the drivers of behavior, and that really is still that test-based education system. They haven't figured out a better way to select for college, although they're trying. But if it really still comes down to that one number when you're 17 or 18 years old, without fixing that, how do you fix the rest of it? At the bottom, you have 2 very vocal Chinese education scholars complaining about the lack of progress. Interestingly enough, despite all the efforts that Beijing has put on reforming the system, you actually talked to 2 teachers, and this was just 2 weeks ago. Teacher Wang, Chinese teacher at Shenzhen Senior High, reform takes time. It has not strongly impacted my teaching style, and the plan has not been discussed at work. So despite everything that they're trying to do, it hasn't really trickled down into the classroom quite yet. On the right side, administrators and principals pay more attention to the reform plan than to teachers. So it's really not depending on where you are, it's really still not trickled down into, impacting what's happening in the classroom and impacting the outcomes for students. The conclusion, my conclusion at least, reform is also driven by market choice, by changing attitudes and international collaborations. So China is probably best in the world at setting up exchanges with schools in America, Europe, and Australia at every level, all from preschool all the way to university. And I think that change will happen as much through that as it is with policy. I mean, there's top down and there's bottom up, but I think all of this is a huge swirling mess, and it's sort of moving in the right direction in this sort of big swirling mess. Trends, I'm trying to think what I should be talking about here. There is a steady pipeline into and out of the education system. As people are waiting for the system to change, the Chinese are voting with their feet. 500,000 Chinese are going abroad for education at all levels, and that number is increasing dramatically. And at the same time, more foreigners are coming in. I am educating my American boy in Shanghai schools, and our presence is affecting the way that his Chinese classmates and parents are looking at education, just as they're impacting me. So these kinds of exchanges on a personal and individual level are happening all over China, and I think that is going to drive change as much as policy is in some ways. Comparisons, what can we learn from each other? So to end on a more positive note, I do feel, in talking to experts over the last few years, there are a few Chinese practices that we could learn from. The first is the Chinese belief in effort over talent. So the Chinese believe that anything is possible with 吃苦 or eating bitter. Real learning is actually very difficult. And I know in America there is Okay, 5 minutes left. There is a tendency to believe that learning should be fun and that we have to get our kids engaged in learning and they have to look forward to it. And I think that makes it quite difficult for teachers. In China, all the experts say, and I've seen it in classrooms, is that if there's a difficult concept, the kids will generally go along. They expect to suffer and struggle through it, and maybe there's certain things that they have to memorize, and that's okay. And rankings are okay. Scores are okay. I put up a photo of a bunch of kids practicing football because in America, generally, we're okay with scores and competition in sports. A 9th place finish in the 100-meter dash just means we need to train harder, right? I think that sometimes we could do a little bit more of that in the classroom, keep the expectations high and expect that, Johnny can do math if he works hard enough. There are studies that have shown that Americans, or Caucasian Americans anyway, not the Asians over here in the US, but Caucasian Americans have a tendency to believe that academics is innate, especially when it comes to math and science. There are studies that show, I'm not making this stuff up. So I do think that's one lesson that we can learn from the Chinese. Even if you're poor and you're rural, you do believe that that kid, let's call him Little Ming, can learn math and eventually advance up that ladder and become premier of China, right? That's basically the belief, and it's very empowering in education. Practice number 2, studies have shown that by the time kids are 5 and 6, the Chinese are out. They get the concepts. They're counting to higher numbers. They get conceptual relationships at the age of 5 and 6, and this is before they even enter formal instruction. And that's because, partly because of the way the Chinese language is structured, but also because informal instruction begins at home. American parents are more likely to emphasize reading, while Chinese parents are more likely to emphasize both reading and math, and that's very powerful. Practice number 3, respect for education. Just one last thought, and I'll finish here. Half of Chinese would encourage children to pursue teaching as a profession. Wonder what you think it is in America. It's not half. It's a quarter. It's about a quarter to a third. This is a study that came out a few years ago. So I think that belief that teaching is important, that education is important, that it drives outcomes is very powerful. And that's another thing that we can learn from the Chinese. Memorize what needs memorizing. There's American education, it gets a bad rap. Americans give memorization a bad rap, but actually the research shows there are certain things that just need to be committed to memory for a number of reasons. And lastly, like I said, all the exchanges and learning from other cultures. I think perhaps that we could do a little bit more of the same. That's it. Thank you.
This book is must read. If you want to know anything about today's China, you have to read this book. And so go ahead and book it now so it'll just show up on your Kindle or in your mailbox come September and the publication date. One of the things that was emphasized, and you could marry one of the chapters from that book with another video that we have on our website that was produced by a Chinese student working with an American student on migrants, on migrant families in Beijing. And in this particular video, and the name of it is called Invisible Wall, so you just do a search for Invisible Wall, it deals with migrant parents who run a bathhouse in Beijing. And they are deciding what to do because their daughter has just reached that hukou determining age. And for her to continue in school, she will have to go back to her home district. So that's something very, very powerful that you might share with your students, in addition to bringing them the examples that Lenora has really worked hard and wonderfully well to bring. So this Little Soldier's a must read.